Welcome and greetings to everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from. My name is Mande Muyangwa, and I am the director of the Africa program at the Wilson Center. On behalf of Dr. Cyril Obi and the Africa Peacebuilding Network at the Social Science Research Council in New York, and the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding at the Wilson Center, I would like to welcome you all to this discussion on natural resources, sustainable development, and peace in Africa. The African Peacebuilding Network and the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding are funded by the Carnegie Corporation in New York with the mission of fostering peace and peacebuilding on the continent. Specifically, the African Peacebuilding Network supports independent African research on conflict-affected countries and neighboring regions of the continent, as well as the integration of African knowledge into global policy communities. The Africa Peacebuilding Network promotes the visibility of African peacebuilding knowledge amongst global and regional centers of scholarly analysis and practical action, and makes this knowledge accessible to key policymakers at the United Nations and other multilateral, regional, and national policymaking institutions. Similarly, the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, a continent-wide network of 23 African policy, research, and academic organizations that work with the Africa program at the Wilson Center to bring African knowledge and perspectives to US, African, and international policy and peacebuilding, and to help build the next generation of African peacebuilders. One of the main features of both networks is to bring that African expertise and knowledge into discussions on critical peacebuilding issues in Africa. The SVNP and the APN also work to collaborate and amplify the work and voices of scholars from across the continent and to share their knowledge with policymakers and practitioners while simultaneously bringing local context and knowledge to US and international policy discussions on key issues related to peace on the continent. Before I introduce our moderator for today, I would like to invite our viewers to interact with us during the event. We are live tweeting today's event at Africa Up Close and at APN_SSRC. We're taking questions on Twitter and via email. To tweet us your questions, please tag Africa Up Close or at APN_SSRC and use the hashtag natural resources, all one word, or email your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. I would now like to introduce my friend, Dr. Cyril Obi, who will serve as the moderator for today's event. Dr. Obi is a program director of the African Peacebuilding Network and the Next Generation Social Sciences in Africa program at the Social Science Research Council in New York, where he brings his extensive research, networking, and publishing experience on African peace, security, and development to the council. He is also a research associate of the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, a visiting scholar at the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University, and an adjunct professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Previously, Dr. Obi served as associate professor at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, the Claude Ake Visiting Chair at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and the Senior Research and Research Cluster Lead on Conflict, Displacement, and Transformation at the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala. Dr. Obi has received multiple academic awards, serves on the boards of several reputable journals, associations, and advisory boards, and is an author, contributor, or editor of several books and journal articles. Dr. Obi received his PhD in political science at the University of Lagos in Nigeria. Dr. Obi, over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Monday, for that very generous introduction. Welcome participants, welcome colleagues. Today promises to be a very exciting event. We will be speaking to a topic that is very much dear to our hearts. It's really going to be, what we really want to do today is to listen to experts and practitioners and to be able to have very solid interactions, meaningful interactions on the question of natural resources, sustainable development, and peace in Africa. Africa, as you all know, is one of the most resource-rich regions of the world. But many observers have noted that in spite of all this natural wealth, Africa seems to have quite a substantial proportion of its population living under poverty. Some go as far as say 50%. In some countries, they say 70% of people live below poverty. So how do you explain this? A rich continent and many people living under poverty. So in many parts of Africa, conflict, natural resources, governance and development, and peace are inextricably linked. The continent's rich and diverse resources have long been objects of conflict, as well as sources of potential and actual development. Most countries depend on their natural resources for local livelihoods, national revenues, and export earnings and foreign exchange. However, exploitation and management, or the lack thereof, and competition over these same resources has at times sparked or sustained violent conflict. In many resource-endowed but impoverished local communities, the exploitation of natural resources results in the degradation of the environment and fuels conflict. Some African civil society organizations play an important role in engaging various stakeholders, managing conflict, building and sustaining peace. Therefore, their engagement in the management of their resources, their country's natural resources, is critical to peace building. This role includes engaging with and expressing the needs and desires of local communities and holding the government and business sectors accountable to ensure development and corporate social responsibility that enables local communities to benefit fully from the resources produced from their lands and waters. However, civil society faces challenges in playing this role, including the shrinking of civic space in some countries, insufficient resources, or capacity of local civil society groups, or even indeed inequalities or asymmetrical relations between international and national civil society organizations, which can lead to the sidelining of local community priorities, voices, and needs. Furthermore, while government and business sector-led community consultation efforts are important, they can sometimes fall short of meaningful inclusion and function merely as checking the box. Equally relevant is the emergence of uncivil society and conflict entrepreneurs who sometimes or who often seek to hijack the grievances of local communities to trigger violence and create chaos in pursuit of their narrow interests. This event will examine the intersection of civil society and peace building in natural resource-rich African countries. It will interrogate their roles in community engagement, the promotion of accountability, transparency, and development based on inclusive, transparent, and sustainable resource management. In this regard, it will address the following related questions, including: what roles have African civil society groups played in natural resource development and management on the continent? What are some of the major challenges they face, and what lessons can be shared from across Africa in engaging and empowering civil society on this issue? How can governments, private businesses, local communities, and civil society work together to build peace and secure just, inclusive, and sustainable development? Finally, the event will offer policy options for boosting the meaningful inclusion of civil society groups and local communities in transforming natural resource development and management. So you see, this is really going to be a very deep conversation that will throw up questions about a continent that is blessed with natural resources and how civil society can partner with other stakeholders to ensure that this endowment, this natural resource endowment, feeds both into development and peace. And the kind of development we're talking about here is sustainable development. To help us in tackling these issues, I have a distinguished panel of practitioners and scholars who have experience in the field, both in terms of engaging with a lot of these issues. Our list of speakers has 4 people, 2 scholars and 2 practitioners. I hope they will be joining us, those who are not yet here. In terms of presentations, we will go with Dr. Dauda Garuba, followed by Dr. Resti Naiga. And when he's able to join us, Dr. Seydina Sene and Dr. Cosmas Milton Obote Ochiem. Before I invite Dr. Garuba to make his speech, I would just introduce him. Dr. Garuba is a technical advisor at the Nigerian Extractive Industries Transparency Initiatives in Abuja, Nigeria. He has wide experience in academic and development policy research and advocacy, development programs design and management, capacity building and grant making on questions of democracy and economic governance, natural resource management, transparency, and social accountability. He is widely published in local and international research outlets. His network of contacts cuts across local, national, sub-regional, and continental spheres. Dr. Garuba has his roots in civil society, but currently works in a huge initiative that manages natural resource receipts and tries to connect this in a transparent way, ensuring accountability to promote sustainable development in Nigeria. Dr. Dauda holds a PhD in political science with specialization in international relations from the University of Benin. You have already heard the questions, Dr. Garuba. You've had the opportunity to look at them ahead of this presentation. So I would give you about 10 minutes to speak to the issues that have been raised. You now have the floor. Please go ahead and address the participants. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that key highlight of the issue. And in addressing the question, I must say that I agree with your opening statement that there is a significant linkage between natural resource, governance, development, conflict, and peace in Africa and even in the country where I come from. And what I understand is that the presence or absence of one of the variables in that chain of words determine the condition of others. For instance, if a country has in place a functional governance framework for managing natural resources, it then becomes easy for such a country to attain peace and development. And when the situation is otherwise, we're going to have the kind of experiences we've had in the past in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Congo DR, and several other countries. So in that sense, it is not about the fact that conflicts are necessarily something that is bad. Of course, conflict are the factual construct of life. And one common denominator we've seen, especially since after the Cold War, is that radical shift from interstate conflicts and ideological positions into what we call maybe internal proclivities that we have seen in terms of resources around renewable and non-renewable natural resources. And one key denominator as well is the fact that even where conflicts that you find in Africa today are not directly linked to natural resources, most of them are tied to natural resources by way of the fact that warlords tend to mobilize the resources from they target certain territories, mobilize the natural resources of those territories and begin to use them to purchase arms and ammunition with which they advance their fight. So from the point of view of what we know about natural resources, the experiences we've had in countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, Equatorial Guinea, and even in other countries like Nigeria, where they are not full-scale war, but we are seeing things of low-intensity conflict and small wars, is that natural resource fuel the world. But most of the time, especially from this part of the world, Africa, they have failed the region or the continent. So in that context, it is something that most regional organizations, as well as international organizations, have paid attention to. For instance, at the level of West Africa has actually witnessed the most atrocious conflicts that are natural resource based than several other regions. And it's also, of course, the only place where regional attempts have been made in redressing the conflicts in this region. And to the rest of the world, we have more, maybe as a result of some of those regional peacekeeping operations we've had in West Africa. We have more that have been learned by the United Nations, and also more that the United Nations have learned from West Africa. The second issue, the role of the various actors you mentioned. We all know that the state is, talking of the state, civil society, local communities, and the private sector. We all know that the state exists to provide security and also guarantee the welfare of its citizens. But why the civil society occupy the space between the private domain as well as the public realm, and the private sector are directly involved in transactions that's commercially of some of these natural resources. If you look at the issue from that point of view, there are diverse interests that have shown themselves in this in the management of conflict or peace building in Africa. So what you then find is that more often than not, the governments are usually seen as in an unholy alliance with the extractive companies against the interests or rights of the community. You see, this interest that over time, communities have often not trusted governments, while relying on civil society to help in mitigating the impact or mediating the encounters between either company and governments on one side against the communities. African Natural Resource Endowment, there's this question as to whether the rate of development. The issue has been that African institutions face several challenges in terms of having to address the conflicts in Africa. Some of the challenges are issues of the absence of effective governance framework, the absence of domestic resource mobilization, because even when the resources belong to Africa, or you discover that those who are exploited, particularly the extractive companies and multinationals, that is where the capital comes from, and you require quite a lot of resources to do the kind of investment that is required. There is also the issue of lack of value addition. We exploit and export in their raw form. We are not able to bring any value to them so that we can better maximize the opportunities that and benefits that are there. There's also the poor access to capital and technical know-how in this situation. Corruption and illicit financial flow has also covered up the entire natural resource processes, and undue compensation, even though there have been several attempts at the level of African Union, for instance, through the African Mining Vision. There have been, for instance, the ECOWAS Mineral Development Policy that had happened over the years, actually in the last 10 years, African Mining Vision have been on. But increasingly, you find national government that hold on to policies that are not in tandem with such a regional or continental vision. So what you find on a daily basis is an undue race to the bottom. And the result has always been that Africa will never ever be able to maximize the opportunity that such provide. So in terms of the compensation for competition over natural resource as the root cause of the conflict, and I said so. Like in my opening statement, I did mention the fact that I agree that natural resource is at the root cause of some of the conflicts you find in Africa. And I also had alluded to the fact that even where natural resources are not the reason for the starting of the conflict, they are largely, they play a helping hand in getting those who are involved, or warlords that are involved in this, to mobilize resources that are used to protract those processes. So, in terms of,
sorry to cut in, you have about 3 minutes left, so you may want to start rounding up now.
Okay, in terms of what had been done by several countries, or what can be done to take care of the bad situation we have in Africa, we need to look at some international instruments that had helped. One of them is the Natural Resource Charter, for instance, which have been used by several, or which is somewhat prescriptive measures in deciding whether a country that had access to natural resource would want to extract. Also, there are issues around getting a good deal. There are also issues about ensuring revenue transparency, managing the volatility. We are currently witnessing the global meltdown, especially as it has to do with oil prices based on the COVID-19. There are issues around investing in sustainable development, because most of these natural resources are largely unrenewable. They are non-renewable, and we need to put in place safeguard mechanisms such as voluntary principles as contained in the global EITI, as contained in the Open Government Partnership, and other voluntary principles around business, security, and human rights. By way of tying up this in terms of my last statement on this, there is the need for civil society to continue in their resilience building strategies to sell some of these voluntary principles that I have highlighted, like the EITI, the Open Government Partnership, assisting regional organizations and continental organizations in pushing the African Mining Vision Agenda, the ECOWAS Minerals Development Policy, as well as the NEPAD. So there are also issues around regular engagement, or if you like, you can call it mediating creating opportunities for mediating encounters between national and local government and local communities, strengthening the role of community, because most of the time, especially for instance in Nigeria, where you have opportunities for community development agreements in terms of what will create a harmonious relationship between companies and local communities. The communities you find are less capacitated to be able to engage on issues like this, and the mediatory role of civil society is very essential in that. Then I think that Africa also needs to have serious investors. We need to look at the local content issue as it relates to natural resource exploitation. Most of the time, it doesn't work for African countries exploiting these resources and exporting them in raw form. We need to have a mechanism to add value to these resources so that they can maximize their take in terms of this. And of course, my last point will be that there should be a cross-pollination or collaboration between international civil society and national civil society in ensuring that the depth of capacity that you referenced in the opening statement is well taken care of, that Africa will be able to exploit their natural resources for the public good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garuba. You have touched on a lot of issues. First, you start by tracing the connections between natural resource abundance or endowment with conflict. And then you looked at the role of the various stakeholders and the important place of civil society in mediating relations between the state and the communities, as well as promoting certain best practices and certain initiatives at the international level for promoting the sustainable use of natural resources. And while Africa may be well resourced, there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of developing those resources, issues of beneficiation, adding value to minerals, for example, having the technology to maximize earnings, promoting responsible investments in the natural resource sector, getting the appropriate technologies, maximizing opportunities, something that jumped out of your presentation. And you have quite a long list of suggestions, both for civil society and governments and the business sector, as to how Africa can benefit a lot more from its natural resources endowment. And on this note, I would then quickly thank you again. Just to add that Dauda Garuba is a former APN research grantee. And I'm now going to move on to Dr. Resti Neiga, who teaches at the Department of Development Studies, Makerere University in Uganda. Resti is a lecturer, and she is in the Department of Development Studies, which is part of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Makerere University. She has a PhD in water governance from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, Austria, and a master's degree in development studies from the University College Dublin in Ireland. She has special interest in natural resources governance, conflict, gender, peacebuilding, and transdisciplinary research design. She has also published widely on the area of, she has published widely in the area of water governance. She is a recipient of an APN research grant, 2019. And for those who may be interested, she's published a very, very interesting policy brief on water management issues in Uganda. This can be found at the APN homepage under publications. Resti, you have 10 minutes to make your presentation.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you for this interesting topic that speaks greatly to my recent research with APN. It is really true that Africa is endowed with the diverse natural resources such as land, water, minerals, oil and gas. And they provide a great source of livelihood to the citizens. They also have great attachment in terms of spiritual, cultural, and historical significance to the rural communities. And the potential for this natural resource to enhance sustainable development cannot be overemphasized, because they provide different linkages such as the backward, the forward linkages, spatial, in terms of infrastructure development, knowledge linkages, in terms of skills and technology. But despite of this, there is a phenomena of resource scarcity in Africa. This is a great challenge, mainly because of the failure for these natural resources to translate into outcomes for the communities. I'll give an example about the recent, since the discovery of oil in Uganda in 2006, over 30,000 have been displaced. That is a good example of a resource scarce. They have been displaced to pave a way for the development in terms of roads, building, industries, and this happens amid this unclear resettlement and compensation plans. Uganda is endowed with lots of water, for instance, Lake Victoria and so many other sources, but less than 50% in rural areas access water, safe water. So this has been turned into a resource curse. And instead what we see more of conflict-ridden. It has become a resource curse because of the fact that it has not benefited the people, but instead it has fueled more complex. Actually, we have the most complex conflicts in Africa, both explicit and implicit. I will also observe that we commonly talk about transboundary conflicts and ignore local conflicts. My recent research with APN spoke to local water conflicts. So as a result of that, we see actually natural resources instead making poor poorer on average than the benefits they gain. What do we have to do about this? Governance is very, very critical. There is challenge where we confuse a lack of and poor governance. So governance is very critical in ensuring that we overcome the resource curse. Governance has a lot to play in terms of ensuring that natural resource management is inclusive and responsive to the needs of the people. Without that, then it's not worth the risk and effort. To achieve good governance, and governance we mean the norms, the institutions, and the processes where power and responsibility on how the resources are shared and used happens. But to achieve good governance that is based on the basic principles such as legitimacy, accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, we need different stakeholders. And these stakeholders include the academia, the researchers, provide the data so that we inform the policy, we take policy-based evidence. We need the civil society to advocate for inclusive governance, but also to act as a bridge between the government and the local people. We need the business sector because we have seen irresponsible mining by the business sector. We need them on board. We need the private sector, and we need researchers to ensure that their research do not only stop on shelves. But how do we achieve this? So to achieve this, a governance is overarching. Without a conducive environment to enable each actor play their role, and the space is increasingly shrinking, whereby some governments, they do not take criticisms in good faith. So like civil society have to be very conscious, or even researchers, on how you package your message. The key challenges to why we have resource curse and why we have not benefited the local people is because we have not made the peace building process an integral part of day-to-day management of natural resources. I'll give an example of the APN funded research. 98% of the water users were facing conflicts on a weekly basis, but 91% reported lack of conflict resolution mechanisms. And conflicts were hindering contribution towards water provision 25 times, meaning a water user who faced conflicts were less willing to contribute towards water provision. Yet contribution is very critical and a demand-driven approach. Communities must contribute if they are to have water. But conflicts hinder that. And conflicts are completely part and parcel of day-to-day access and use of water, just because of diverse uses of water. Conflicts between agriculture, crop farmers, and pastoralists, conflicts over quality, conflicts over, and the findings actually concluded that the key challenge to lack of access to safe water was not a lack of water, but how water is governed. It was a governance question. Similarly, it comes to land with the discovery of minerals. In Uganda, people have been displaced with poor resettlement and compensation plans. And on a daily basis, there is resistance over that. So that becomes a governance question rather than so. To overcome the resource curse, I suggest that peace building should be an integral part of day-to-day management. We must have robust governance systems that are legitimate, that are transparent, that is willingness to overcome corruption, which is more of a political role. We must embrace the extractive industries transparency initiative that has been promoted widely as a means of promoting accountability in the extractive industry, especially this is critical with the discovery of oil in most African countries. So we must embrace that initiative. We must have conflict resolution mechanisms in place that are well established within the system. And we must ensure the stakeholder analysis. Who are the stakeholders in the different, because the context differ. Water may need different regulation from land, from oil, from gas. So the context specific stakeholder analysis is very critical. Stakeholder engagement is very important. So such that conflict resolution should not be an afterthought after people have resisted, for instance, resettlement, and then we think about it. So when I give an example of Uganda and the research I did on local water conflicts, conflict resolution mechanisms are completely missing, and peace building is not an integral part. And therefore, I see if we have these natural resources to enhance development, peace building is central and must be promoted. And it should take a generic process right from the beginning up to the end. I would wish to talk about power relations as far as natural resource management is concerned, power relations, and especially gender. The policies do not seem to be gender responsive, even when policies are well articulated about participation of different sections of the population, such as women and men. Women largely continue to miss in this game. For instance, we see this building land compensation in the Albertine region. Men take decisions solely without participation of women, but women carry the burden of the displacements, of the settlements, of food security, lack of water. Women carry the burden, but they are not included. We need responsive and inclusive regulatory framework. We need data to inform these policies, to inform this stakeholder analysis. For instance, I realized that there is scanty research on conflict. There is scanty research, even funding. Apart from African Peace Building Network, I have not come across funders that really specifically emphasize the research to focus on peace, on conflicts and peace building. Yet it is becoming critical for natural resource utilization and management in Africa.
Thank you so much, Resty, for your very interesting presentation. You have added very interesting dimensions in your responses. First of all, you look at the relationship between natural resources and development, and you speak to the natural resource curse, which is something that features prominently in a lot of analysis and in a lot of policy thinking about how to resolve that nexus between development and natural resource endowment. But very interestingly is that you take your analysis down to the grassroots, to the community level, where you have done considerable work on water-related conflicts within the community and the whole question of how competing water use drives conflicts at the level of the community. And you make a very interesting connection between the absence of conflict resolution mechanisms at the everyday level for such grassroots located conflicts. And I think that's a very important point. The other important point you make is about accountability. But you also subsume all this under that big framework of governance. And that is something we are going to look at in discussions later on. Finally, is a question of gender. And I'm not trying to equate gender to women, but you then looking at the Albertine region, and you speak to how men take all the decisions, but women who are really impacted and who do a lot of the day-to-day work are excluded. So I would thank you so much for your presentation. At this point, we are going to invite questions from members of the audience. You have listened to two very important presentations. We are still waiting for Dr. Cosmas to come up, but while we are waiting, we would really welcome members of the audience to ask questions to our two presenters. So I'll just take a pause and we watch out for these questions. I have one question already, and I'm going to read it to our two participants, Dr. Garuba and Dr. Naiga. You should feel free to answer this question. It says, many thanks for organizing such an important conversation. Let's talk about how we as Africans could manage our natural resources without outside exploitation and environmental degradation. So, Dr. Garuba, what do you have to say about this? You can unmute, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I think my presentation actually started from the correlation between the key chain words in the conversation. And I did mention something around governance. And I also said that the absence of or the presence of one of those variables actually determined what a country gets or the ultimate result that we find in a country. If you're going to take it, and for me, there are both sides if you were to look at things from Africa. Yes, it is true that the bad examples are more, especially in the context of the conflicts we've witnessed across the continent. But today, Botswana stands out as one of those African countries that have been able to effectively mobilize its natural resource for the development of the common good. And perhaps the way in which leadership is structured in Africa, it may not be deliberate, but maybe it's a fallout of bad governance. That is why we are having to sit and talk about the external solutions to the problem. We live in a continent where leaders are more interested in what is said about them outside of the continent than what they actually do or what citizens of their country say about them. And that, of course, that is why you see more of the solution also coming by way of asking that countries key into the international principles around, when I mentioned the EITI, the Open Government Partnership. But the fact actually remains that if any of the African countries, especially those that are rich in natural resources, are going to transform or transcend conflicts and not to perpetually remain on the side of trying to quench the fire, there is a need to look at the governance framework. And that's actually where I started from. It doesn't matter whether that governance framework is a borrowed idea, but the fact is that it has to be retooled in such a way that it works with existing realities in the various, in the countries. And for me, the government framework is largely about transparency and accountability. It's largely about pursuing the general good for the people. It's largely about looking beyond what do I call it? Some gigantic buildings that people look at when they define development, but meeting those basic needs of the communities that may not necessarily be structural. It's not about having buildings that are beautiful in a capital or all those things, but it should be about providing the basic needs to the people: education, health facilities, and the likes of those things that will provide the common, that's what we call the human security needs of the citizens. And for me, that is actually what we need. Even when we look out for what we can get from outside, our primary concern should be, how does it assist the common man or uplift the common man out of poverty? I just finished coordinating a major mining research across the 6 geopolitical zones of the country. And it's so appalling what you see as the condition of women and children who mine or who live in mining communities across the 6 geopolitical zones of this of my country, Nigeria. And it speaks more to the key issue that we are looking at. And that is why the way I connected the dots across the stakeholders that are involved in mining is, yes, it is true that government needs money to enhance its work and provide development for the people. It is also true that companies would want to profit from their investment. It is true that communities want to have something to hold on to by virtue of the resources placed at their disposal by God or nature. But civil society seems to be the best stakeholder in between this contestation that will be mediating the encounters. But for all the stakeholders, I'm trying to make my last statement, what should become the priority is that there is always going to be a life after natural resources, given that most of the natural resources that we are talking of here, especially those that carry much weight in terms of ability to mobilize money or finances or capital, especially as those natural resources, there will always be going to be life after them. So we shouldn't be looking at a situation where we'll sacrifice the future in the search for natural resources that is going to help today. So the generations yet unborn require, the interest of the generation yet unborn requires that the kind of governance mechanism that we are putting in place should be such that meets the needs of the present, as well as provide the necessary investment that will guarantee the future of the generation yet unborn. just take a look at it. We have Norway, we have Saudi Arabia, a few other countries that are using their earnings from natural resource well. The question you ask yourself, if the generations, the children of our generation and the children of those countries' generation were to meet in future and have a conversation and will be interested in like appraising their forefathers, what will be the judgment that will be passed by the children of this generation as to how Africa, in spite of its huge natural resources, have been able to use such resources to lay a foundation that deliver the kind of future that we want for them. So for me, everything lies at the center of governance, but in achieving this, you cannot do it alone. You have to look at those issues within the country as well as outside of the countries where you can borrow some lessons that would deliver the transformation of natural resource for the country, as against the violence every day that we have in our midst. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garuba, for that passionate intervention from the floor. You have elaborated a bit more on governance, but there'll be questions coming back to you on what exactly is this word governance and how can it address the obvious challenges that you have so eloquently identified. How can governance actually address the redistribution of resources in ways that can help transform society and move it away from poverty? How can it maximize human security? How can it actually ensure that resources become the foundation of a future and that they are not just wasted today? I was struck by the statement that you made that there will be life after natural resources. That, of course, will be after perhaps non-renewable natural resources, because some of the natural resources are renewable. And with the fourth industrial age knocking at our door, the fourth industrial revolution, Africa actually has a lot of potential at transformation with the kind of spaces and opportunities that are coming up. Let me remind our audience that people should tweet their questions or email to africa@wilsoncenter.org. Please do that. We have some time and we have the opportunity of this panel of experts to respond to your questions. Now, Resty, I would like your reactions to the set of issues that we raised quite briefly, and then we'll come back to another set of questions. I have a question waiting here on the relationship between exploitation and corruption in relation to natural resources. But before that, Resty, you have the floor.
I will answer that question of how we can utilize our natural resources without external influence. I will answer this with a kind of a question. I may not get the answer, but it would provide a good answer. We have quite a number of African countries, for instance, where, of course, all African countries are endowed with land, with water, and also quite a number now, they have discovered oil. In Uganda, it's most recent, 2006, but in most countries like Nigeria, it's a way back. The question that arises how we can really utilize our natural resources without external, of all these African countries where minerals have been discovered. Do we manage our resources the same way? Can't we learn from others, benchmarking, co-learning from other African countries? Do we all do our things the same way? Our standards the same? Is our governance system the same? So we need to benchmark from other African countries, for instance, where these resources have been discovered, and see how they are doing things, and we benchmark. Benchmarking is a good way of doing things. And another question is, why do we have external influence? There are reasons. There are reasons. Sometimes they could be, however trivial, whatever, but there are reasons as to why we have external influence. For instance, let me take a recent example, which is really making headlines in BBC every day on Focus on Africa. The recent conflict of the Ethiopia with Nile Dam, trying to build down. And then Egypt and Sudan are contesting and asking UN to intervene. We ask external, can't we fall back to another African country and ask African leaders to intervene? So why do we have to? Don't we have trust in ourselves? Don't we have confidence? So there are reasons as to why we have really, you see, this is why I talked about governance. You know, the governance that stands the test of time should provide the means of self-assessment, but also external audit. So when we assess ourselves, do we have the capacity to resolve our conflicts or we do not? Because right away, Egypt and Sudan is running to UN to stop Ethiopia from making that. So sometimes we do that because do we have the capacity? We have discovered the oil and gas. Do we have the capacity? Do we have what it takes? Do we have what it takes? So that alone will, lack of capabilities will attract external. And also doing things in a way that is exclusive and that raise contestation will obviously attract external. That's really the way I see it. So it all surrounds about governance. Do we have a robust governance system? The rules that stand the test of time, are they legitimate? Are they accountable? Are they transparent? So if we do that, then we shall have the capacity to utilize our resources without external, with minimal. We may not avoid because we really depend on each other. No country can claim to be self-sustaining, even the developed ones, but we can really have minimal intervention.
Thank you very much, Resty. You have also touched on governance, but looking at our capacity to utilize our resources. I would add probably the point about beneficiation, which was raised by Dauda Garuba, is quite useful at this point. That first, the question has to do with control of those natural resources. Who really controls these resources? How much benefit do we extract from these resources internally before they're exported? What are the multiplier effects for adding value to the natural resources that we possess? The whole question of conflict is something you have mentioned over shared resources. So it's not just natural resources, we're also talking about shared and transboundary resources. How do you manage them? And who really would build the peace? Would it be exclusively African actors or external, such as multilateral organizations like the United Nations? But we'll come back to that later. There is a question that I have that I'm going to pose to two of you again. It says, there are several scandals across the continent involving high-level corruption, centered misappropriation of natural resource revenues. How can civil society do a better job to check this corruption? What is the role of regional economic communities and the African Union in bringing natural resource management more centrally into the African governance architecture? I understand that some members of our audience are looking forward to hearing from Dr. Ocheng, but we just received information that there is a power outage in Abidjan, where he would be calling in from, and unfortunately the power outage has affected his ability to join us. We are working very hard in the background to make sure that he joins us, and I hope that before we bring proceedings to a close, that he will be able to join us. So Dr. Garuba, Dr. Naiga, the question is, why are there scandals around misappropriation of natural resource revenues? And what can our regional organizations do this? And how can we connect this to a regional governance architecture or framework? So, Dr. Garuba, I call on you one more time.
Yeah, it is true that across Africa, what you read and hear about natural resource governance has been scandalous. And in Nigeria, where I come from, I often make this statement each time I had to cause to engage these issues, to say that the oil and gas sector is the most investigated sector in Nigeria, at least since the return to civil rule in 1999. If you were to go to the National Assembly, if you were to go, where you have two chambers of lawmakers, if you were to go into the executive offices, you're also going to find a lot of probe panels, committees, task force that have been instituted to deal with one governance issue, particularly transparency and accountability, or the other. And the basic reason for this is that we have not built a continent that could survive outside of natural resource exploitation and transaction. And that is why you find in almost every country that is rich in natural resources, there is no job other than wait, exploit, sell, and the money becomes an issue of contestation between political elites. And that is why in the Nigerian context, like I had argued in some of my writings, is that for somebody who wants to become a governor in faraway Sokoto, somebody who wants to become a senator in faraway Enugu, somebody who wants to become a House of Representative or a councillor in a local government or a chairman of a local government, it's a rat race for oil and gas money. So in a situation of such desperation, and where everybody is scrambling to grab what's in the provincial sense in Nigeria is called the national cake, what do you expect? And Claude Ake actually fixed this well when in his writing, this has also affected the nature of the politics we play, in which he said that there are no rules and there are no referees. So it takes us back to the conversation about governance. And it's also in this context that even companies that are doing business that are extractive related will always look for one strong politician or one big man that is behind them that will help them to have their back as to the kind of practices, the kind of untoward practices that they are engaging in this country. And for me, in deepening the issue, the basic question is, what exactly are the governance mechanisms you need in this context? And the leaders need to ask themselves, what are those basic things that the ordinary citizen is interested in? At the very, very basic, the ordinary citizen wants to have food, wants to have a roof to put over his head, he wants to have education, he wants to have Medicare, and needs roads. In my trying to write my PhD dissertation, I worked on oil theft, for instance. In crisscrossing the Niger Delta, trying to find out how oil is stolen in the Niger Delta, I found a high chief of a community that told me they should leave our children alone. Oh, at least our children can now build houses. In some other parts, I found areas where all the beautiful houses in the environment, they will be pointing to them and say, it is oil theft money. That is what stops a government from promoting a housing policy that enables everybody, that allows for everybody's access. It's just a key example. Look at it. In Africa, we are all locked in today as a result of COVID-19. Even the money stolen by politicians have become so useless that they are, even because of the closure of airports, they are unable to travel to even seek basic Medicare. And some people are dying in the process. So these are some of the key things I think we need to manage. The other one is the issue of top-down planning. Government often think, or those at the level of government often think that they know what the citizens want. Putting the right mechanisms in place for governance require that you talk to the people and identify what are the basic things that you may just so realize that some of those big magnificent structures that you think the citizens are more interested in, it's not what they are interested in. They require even much less. Transparency and accountability. When a government is transparent and accountable to its citizens, it also helps in dowsing the expectations of its citizens. All over the world, everybody thinks that Nigeria is rich in oil. I had calls to engage people and say, okay, this is the total reserve of Nigeria oil. Let's just decide to take it off from the ground today. And what is the price of crude oil? Let's sell it, even at the time when it was $100 per barrel. And say, this is the population of the country. Let's share the money. If we share that money, you see, realize that in terms of money to the population, we actually don't have, the expectations are just unnecessarily high. Actually, the population has swallowed the expected money. So we need to establish, moving forward in the governance team, I want to see a system where African leaders establish a standard beyond which or below which their citizens should not fall. The moment you have established that standard, then you then factor in the conditions of the resource-bearing community to address the challenge of governance. If we are not doing this, and we are thinking we are pulling all this together as leaders, because Klodake has rightly said, why people fight over poverty, over politics across Africa, why we rig elections, why we plan coups, is because of the way we have structured our life that makes it look like whoever has access to political power, ipso facto has access to the economy or to the resources. So until we sit down to address these key issues, we not move anywhere. Yes, it is true that we've had in place instruments like the African Mining Vision, that you talk of a continental response, even regional response, we have them in place. But there is a huge disconnect between the national policies and this regional or continental instrument. I have just also been involved in a research where I've been able to establish this. A lot of African leaders go to the African Union. A lot of ECOWAS leaders go to ECOWAS, SADC, and all other areas to speak glowingly about what should happen at the continental level and what should happen at the regional level. But when they go back home, what they do is antithetical to the philosophy that are promoted in those areas. We are 10 years old this year when we launched the African Mining Vision. In terms of implementation, Publish What You Pay just made a release on where we are on implementation. We are at a very sorry state, and that sends the message or asks the question as to whether we are really ready to walk the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garuba. Resty, I would have to ask you to wait for some time because I have some good news that Dr. Usman Sene is able to now join us. He would make some brief remarks, and I would allow you and Dr. Garuba to come back for two minutes at the end so that we can round up. Dr. Seydina Usman Sene is a senior economist at the Initiative Prospective Agricole et Rural. He's a senior economist at this organization called IPA. He's a head researcher and project manager of a multi-year project funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on water hygiene and sanitation in Senegal. At IPA, Dr. Sene is a lead researcher and coordinator of a project focusing on the development of agricultural database for food security and agricultural policies in Senegal. He serves as a technical director on the Sustainable Development Goals, working in collaboration with the Office of General Direction for Long-Term Economic Planning and Policy in Senegal. In the framework of No One Left Behind, he works on open data algorithms, promoting the use of private and disaggregated data, tracking SDG goals and targets in Senegal in collaboration with UNICEF. Seydina is also involved in impact evaluation on weather insurance index and farmer investment behavior project in collaboration with 3IE. He has distinctive skills in statistics, econometrics, and provides training and practical solutions in relation to building capacity initiatives. He holds a PhD in applied economics, a master's in finance investment, also a master's in econometrics from Louisiana State University. He is an author of many articles in academic journals, and his research interest focuses on econometrics, causal inference, impact evaluation, and incomplete markets, fiscal and monetary policy, and other economic and financial issues. Dr. Sene may not be able to appear on our video, but definitely you would hear his voice. So Dr. Sene, yes, we are happy to have you. Please proceed.
I will be on videos. I'm turning on mine right now.
That's a bonus. Thank you so much.
Happy to hear. Yeah. Enable me to have the video, but I click on it, it's not on.
Okay, please go ahead with your presentation. We just want to hear you. You can put on the video later when it works, right, but please proceed.
First of all, thank you so much for you all, and thank you for the Wilson. A special thank you to them because I've been collaborating with the Wilson Center through the networks. Is a member of Southern Voice and has been actively engaging with Wilson Center. The work that Wilson Center is actually doing in the continent, looking at the issue of peace building and then policy is of paramount interest of IPAR, and I think is also contributing to really developing understanding when it comes to conflict resolution, peace building infrastructure in the continent. I'm a little bit sorry because I got malaria in the past week, so I've been battling with it, and then I'm recovering for today as I speak to Ian yesterday. The issue is actually that they raise, as always, is very interesting in Africa right now when you look at natural resources and peace building. And I will be speaking from two standpoints. I'll be speaking from the water resource management standpoint, and I'll be speaking also from the land management issues that are mostly pressing right now in Senegal, but I think this is also something that is also going on within the African continent. And then we put that in perspective when we look at governance and then look at the model of economic policy that African government are putting in place in order to really manage the resources. The other issue that I wanted to bring is, like when we talk about peace, I think peace building is a long process, and the process has to be really nurtured, but also systems to put in place to be able to really prevent crisis happening again as it was in the past 10 years. Africa is rising, yes, but there are still spots that can still contain conflict that might really jeopardize the evolution of economic development that Africa is taking right now, especially in this difficult time. When it comes to now natural resources, our goal and ambition in the past 2 years, working with the governor of Senegal, was trying to impact the economic dimension of peace building and natural resources management in Africa, especially in Senegal. We wanted to capture how disorder occurred in threatening peace building. And when we talk about disorder, we rank it like from civil riot to military conflict. And then these riots and protests are now widespread in Senegal. And then we are monitoring this data, looking at a wide dashboard that was put in place by a system called ELI. And that system will just really document the number of riots and protests that are taking place in Africa against the civilians, in order to really prevent and engage meaningful discussion within community, within municipality and at state level to really engage in talking about these pressing issues that can lead to conflict. The idea is behind that is now, in the past 10 years, the several political violence that we have observed in the West African country especially, they are always coming from civilian battles against land grabbing, civilian battles against access to water, civilian battles also against farming practices, and then big farmers and then big industry taking land from them. What we really documented throughout this process in the past 5 years was we looked at now how we can move rapidly from communication of dissatisfaction from the community to a rapid political violence within a country. And that take different phases that go from really a pre-contemplate phase where community are dissatisfied from what is happening in terms of water resources, land resources in their own community, like we are observing right now in Senegal, when big industry are now coming with their money and then taking the land from the farmers. And then also water is now not being accessible to those communities. And they move from being an organized group of protests and moving to mobilizing more people, especially the youth, to political violence against the police in place where usually the state responds, but respond very badly against the civilian in turn out really threatening the peace building process and peace stability in this country. And then one of the examples that I give, especially in Senegal, in the past 3 months only, we have actually in the past data from it was 368 protests that are attached to land issues, 438 that are attached to water issues, and most of these conflicts have turned out to be at least deadly, because if we didn't lose youth, especially the youth, we have lost maybe a village or we have lost a community. And when you look at also other countries like Guinea, you look at also Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, the data is staggering. You can see the number of protests within the community going on. And the issue is here, what we need to understand as African policymakers is, yes, it's good at the higher level from the government standpoint to talk about policy and then making sure that policy are enacted and put in place. But I think what is happening on the ground within the community also are more important in terms of really monitoring the little crisis that can turn out to be very violent and really disturb the whole peace building infrastructure and process that we are actually putting in place and building with the African community, ECOWAS, and the African Union in place. And to me, these are data that are live and ongoing and being documented by the community, by the municipality, by the state. And I think it can serve our policymakers to really monitor the hot spot in the continent. Because I think if we're not careful in the 21st century, the biggest crisis that Africa will have will not be oil alone, as we might think, but it will be like waters and then land. Because right now in Senegal, the issue is so burning that the government had to step up and then really stop everything that is land acquisition along the coastal area of 700 kilometers in Senegal. That's number one. Number two, now when you look at inside the countries, the issue is burning because now big agro-business industry now are really expanding their business as Africa is now having a model of new middle class emerging. And I think that also really create the appetite for agribusiness industry to acquire more land for their value chain development industry. And what is now the most pressing issue is when you look at these West African countries, most of the time, we have a center planned government. And when you have a center planned government, everything that is related to institutions and policy is at the center and then controlled by the government. What does it mean? It means that, you know, big investor or agribusiness industry that are foreigners, when they come, they have only one officer or one policy maker to talk to, which is really, to me, is facilitating actually what we can call the so-called corruption, because if now municipality had the independence to rule and manage their own resources, we might not be seeing many sports at the same time taking place where we have so many conflicts. But because of the central planner system of model of economic of governance that we have, today you can see the state is completely disconnected with what is happening on the ground. And most of the time it surprises them when this crisis happen. And for the case of Senegal, when you combine political violence and protest, you can see that happening almost every single day at a rate of maybe between 20 to 70 protests taking place inside Senegal. And the same thing is happening to Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Burkina, and Côte d'Ivoire. And these are the issues that we wanted to raise and spark discussion about it. Because when we talk about natural resources right now in Africa, we
Thank you, Dr. Sene. I'm sorry that I may have to cut you short now because we have to close in another 6 to 7 minutes. You will have time to come back to make closing remarks. We have a couple of questions waiting, so I hope that is okay. Hello, Dr. Sene.
It's okay with me.
It's okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's okay with me.
So we have several questions from our audience, and I'm going to read them out. Please feel free to answer those that you can. First is a question from Zelina Bartholomew. Given Dr. Naiga's comment that conflict resolution is not enough, how do both panelists envision collaboration when it comes to natural resource management? Where should it take place, and who are the key stakeholders who should be involved that may not be present there currently? Question 2, corruption is often cited as a major hindrance on any advancement or progress in governance within Africa. How can public-private partnerships either mitigate or exacerbate this issue? Question 5 is from Johns Hopkins University. How can communities both benefit from the region's natural resource abundance while also investing in more sustainable industries, both in energy but also other sectors? The natural resource sector represents such incredible opportunity, but as Dr. Garuba has mentioned, these resources are not sustainable and could even contribute to regional instability. So, dear colleagues, presenters, I'm sorry, you will have just 1 minute to respond to one of these questions, and we would also allow Dr. Usman to also come back to us. We just have 5 minutes to do this. I know you are all experts and you can do this. So quickly, let's start with Resti Naiga. We'll go to Dr. Garuba, and then we end with Dr. Sene. Dr. Naiga, you have the floor. 1 minute.
Yeah. 1 minute to respond to the 3.
One question that you feel is really important that you can respond to.
Okay, the key stakeholders in conflict resolution, as I already mentioned, there are different key stakeholders in this. The private sector, the business sector, the government, the civil society. have a role to play, and including researchers have a role to play in this. And these relationships should not be looked at as conflictual. We rather complement each other because each stakeholder has an expertise to bring about. But I would also want to comment about how communities can benefit. How communities can benefit. We other stakeholders, the government, the private sector, the researchers, we should act as a bridge to these communities. We should build their capacity. We should continuously carry out sensitization and awareness creation, let them know their rights, let them know their existing laws, let them also know the gaps within the laws, and advocate for inclusive policies. We need to build their capacity. Sometimes they lack the capacity to benefit even when they can.
Thank you. Thank you very much for keeping to time. Dr. Garuba, 1 minute.
Yeah, there is the issue of the question asked about how can the private sector and the government, private and public sector cooperate in addressing the issue of natural resource and conflicts in Africa. For me, there's no silver bullet to this issue, but what I understand is natural resources belong to the entire country and its citizens. And in deciding how to proceed in terms of how to benefit, the responsibility should not be left to the government and the private sector alone. The citizens should be part of that process. And even at the level of the citizens, the conversation should be deepened to get to the local communities or the natural resource bearing communities. For me, that is essential. The next question was on which is this last I will attend to in this situation is that yes, it is true that there is a need to pursue natural resource, but the ultimate goal should be about sustainable development, which is moving outside the natural resources and into other things that will ensure the survival of countries. But the reality of the situation we find ourselves in Africa, and I'm also going to use Nigeria as an example. We have a government that came into place since 2015, and the cardinal approach to developing the country actually was zeroed down on improvement in focusing agriculture and also the solid mineral sector. But the reality is that even if you want to diversify the economy from natural resource into more sustainable venture, you still be falling back to the resources from natural resources to do that diversification. So it is in this context that I strongly feel that, yes, but we should also be able to genuinely or seriously use the resources from natural resources to engage in that diversification. Thank you.
Dr. Sene, just 1 minute, please. 1 minute so I can round up. 1 minute.
I just wanted to speak to how do we make sure that community benefit from these natural resources? I think for community to be able to benefit from these natural resources exist in their community, the municipality have to have the independence to manage their own resources. In most of the states in West African countries, municipality do not have that power. Municipality have not the mandate, neither the resources, nor the technical resources and the human resources to be able to manage the resources. And for community to engage with the municipality in a meaningful way, knowing their city, knowing their community, they have to be empowered, they have to be educated, but they also have to have a clear map of the natural resources that exist in their community and how they can benefit from that. Instead of having the state coming and negotiating with this big agro-business industry, and then now talking about how do we now make sure that we give them food, or we give them school, or we give them well, or we give them electricity.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Excellent presentation by the three of you. It's my responsibility to thank the Wilson Center's Africa program, to thank Dr. Dauda Garuba, Dr. Resti Naiga, as well as Dr. Seydina Usman Sene for sharing their expertise, their experience, and their insights onto this very, very exciting topic, looking at natural resources, sustainable development, and peace in Africa. And until next time, it's goodbye for now, and have a nice rest of the day wherever you may be. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you, and bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.